Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this lecture on human evolution. Evolutionists propose that humankind accidentally evolved from some primordial chemical soup, which would make humans a mere chemical accident. Could this be true? What does the word say about mankind? Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. Did you know that the human body provides living proof of the fantastic organizational capabilities of our Creator? If you could break up your body into its basic components, the raw materials, you will see that it is made up almost entirely of only 13 basic ingredients, chemical elements, and those ingredients are all found within the dust of the earth. Genesis 3:19. For you were made from dust, and to dust you will return. So the basic ingredients in your body are not worth much, but in God's powerful creative hands, these worthless ingredients were combined into thousands upon thousands of different and very complex chemical components. He then placed these components into cells, about 100 million cells in just one human. These cells were then organized into organs and tissues, all of which work together with each other. Each cell has its own function to perform and will continue with that function until it is damaged or replaced. Clearly, your body does not simply consist of a bag of chemicals, but it is specifically designed so that everything can work together. That is why your body can grow and maintain itself, respond to various changes, and also repair itself. Did you know that Adam had no permanent disability after God removed one of his ribs during the first operation ever to create Eve? Why not? Because the rib is the one bone that can regrow if the surrounding membrane, the periosteum, remains intact. Jacques Monod said the following: man has to understand that he is a mere accident. While George Gaylord Simpson, an American paleontologist, in his book The Meaning of Evolution said, man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. But what does the Word of God say? This is the book of the genealogy of Adam. In the day that God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them and called them mankind in the day they were created. From early childhood, our children are being taught about millions of years as well as bones and skeletons that apparently belong to our so-called ancestors. Every now and then we hear of yet another discovery of some ape-like creature, now our newest ancestor. You may know of one of the most recent discoveries exhibited at Marupeng, South Africa, named Australopithecus sediba, and discovered by Dr. Lee Berger and his son, as well as the controversial Homo naledi. Scientists have given a name to all these human-like and non-human evolutionary predecessors, hominids. Is it really true that such skeletal remains were discovered? Are we really related to apes? Yes. Skeletal remains, fossils of humans and apes have been discovered, and lots of them. However, completely in contradiction to what you're being taught, these remains confirm the creation of only one human species, Homo sapiens. Creation scientists are always very excited about these new discoveries precisely because closer investigation reveals such clear evidence against evolution. Usually, however, you are only given the evolutionary interpretation because almost the whole world has been deceived by the concept of evolution. If you don't actively search for the truth, you will never find it. You certainly won't find it in popular magazines, newspapers, or TV programs. That is one of the major reasons for the book and for this series, to make it a little bit easier for you. If human beings are just the accidental result of chemistry working over time, why would they be deserving of any respect? Would we hold a funeral service if a few pounds of baking soda were destroyed by reacting with vinegar? Clearly, human beings are not just complex chemical reactions. If people are just chemistry working over time, then they have no choice in what they do, just as vinegar has no choice but to react with baking soda. Therefore, why should we punish people who do evil if they have no choice? There could be no such thing as human freedom of dignity if evolution were true. John Dewey was a strong supporter of Darwinism. He was the founder of the progressive education movement, which aimed to indoctrinate, amongst others, the youth in evolution and humanism. The principle of humanism is to make man and everything concerning him the center of attention. Modern humanism rejects Christianity, placing its faith in the power of man to conduct his own destiny. It is therefore a human-centered view instead of a God-centered view. In 1933, Dewey became the president of the American Humanist Association, and their basic philosophy was published later in the same year as the Humanist Manifesto, and this was updated in 2003. This became the official framework of education in most school books, as evolutionists realized that they had to take control of public education. Shortly after the association was formed, they began to work very closely with scientific federations to promote the hypothesis of evolution, and in association with the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, they ensured that legal action would force Americans to accept the evolutionary concept. When we give this more than a moment's thought, the following statement by Adolf Hitler makes a lot of sense. Let me control the textbooks, and I will control the state. Professor Adam Sedgwick of Cambridge recognized the real purpose behind Darwin's book the moment he read it. From first to last, it is a dish of rank materialism, cleverly cooked and served up. And why is this done? For no other reason, I am sure, than to make us independent of a creator. Darwin realized that his idea could and would destroy the faith of millions of believers worldwide. This also undoubtedly contributed to the rampant ill health Darwin experienced, especially during the period when he was working on his theory. Oxford University professor of medicine, Sir George Pickering, diagnosed him with psychoneurosis. Darwin even referred to his Origins book as my accursed book. Now, the general evolutionary hypothesis teaches that about 5 to 7 million years ago, humans, in other words, your great-great-grandpa, and apes, chimpanzees, split from a common, though completely unknown ancestor, which in itself evolved from some unknown primordial pond scum, which, of course, came from nothing. They further say that modern humans, in other words, us, only evolved up to about 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. The physical evolution now came to an end, while the cultural and social evolution continued. This is where we had to abandon our monkey business and start learning manners, but some of us are still struggling with that though. Here we are dealing with a serious attempt by evolutionists to try and explain why there are no records of evolution having taken place in historical time. Of course, there's no evidence that evolution is happening today either. If human evolution were true, all moms should have gained an extra arm by now, and the fossils should be arranged roughly in the following progressive order: Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and modern humans, Homo sapiens. Instead, however, fossils are discovered in various layers without any definitive evolutionary progression. If humans, the Homo sapiens one, are the same today as approximately 100,000 plus years ago, Why did they only start to write down information, build buildings, and manufacture various things during the last few thousand years? Why does the provable human written history, which includes writings, buildings, and artifacts, only date back to about 5,000 years? They also say that humans evolved a modern brain somewhere between 500,000 and 150,000 years ago. So now I just wonder, why did he wait until only 5,000 years ago before he began to use it? Isn't it sad how some people today question God as the creator, rather choosing to believe in an evolutionary fairy tale? In God's wisdom and omnipotence, he knew this would happen a long time before it did. Therefore the Lord said, inasmuch as these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but have removed their hearts far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the commandment of men. For the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hidden. Surely you have things turned around. Shall the potter be esteemed as the clay? For shall the thing made say of him who made it, he did not make me? Or shall the thing formed say of him who formed it, he has no understanding? Now, if there's one thing that'll make you believe in evolution, it is the illustrations and reconstructions of our so-called primitive ancestors. But since no one has ever seen one of our ancestors, the ability, talent, and especially the imagination of the artists that compiled them is like something out of this world. It really gives new meaning to the words science fiction. Evolutionists won't easily be deterred in their efforts to indoctrinate the public on evolution. The opposite, that God is the creator, is completely unacceptable to them. From a purely scientific point of view, their position, illustrations, and reconstructions or imitations are absolutely outrageous and completely unscientific. Most of you must have seen this kind of illustration before. It is a parade consisting of 15 figures, the drawing of an artist that was used to illustrate the so-called human evolution from beginning to end, from goo to you via the zoo. This chapter deals with the via the zoo part. It commences with upright walking proto-apes, followed by various other apes, all the way to magnificent you and me. It's made its first appearance in the Time Life Nature Library series book entitled Early Man. This parade was one of the most successful weapons ever used to promote the idea of human evolution. Why? Because people could see it. Do you know that saying, seeing is believing? Well, here's the proof. It is so simple, clear, and convincing, and because most people so readily believe what they see, this display and the idea of human evolution is still deeply entrenched in the minds of millions of people worldwide today. There are few places where this parade was not displayed. The only problem is that in this case, you cannot believe what you see. Although recent fossil discoveries clearly show that this counterfeit parade has never existed, the more shocking fact is that right from the start, the parade was a huge scam. Inside the accompanying book, Early Man, the parade was described as fiction, meaning this is what they thought, believed it should look like. There is still absolutely no evidence for this. One of the biggest deceptions, and really just another attempt to brainwash an uninformed public, was to display the so-called proto-apes as walking upright, not standing, walking. Evolutionists know that these apes never walked on 2 feet like human. But you see, it was displayed in this deceptive way on purpose. It certainly was not by accident. Consequently, you are misled and brainwashed to believe that apes were walking upright from the beginning, just like humans. Another lie, a very, very successful one. C.S. Lewis wrote, No clever organization of rotten eggs could ever produce a good omelette. Let's look at some definitions. Anthropology is the study of the origin and behavior of mankind. Paleoanthropology is the study of human hominid fossils. And as mentioned before, hominid is the term used for fossils that are considered by evolutionary anthropologists to be the evolutionary predecessors, human and non-human, of mankind. It follows that we, Homo sapiens, are the last remaining hominids. According to Dr. Bernard Zipfel, curator of the fossil collection at Wits University, South Africa, the term hominid is used to describe features that display, amongst others, the following characteristics. Smaller canines, a shortage of space between the canines and incisors, perhaps a bigger brain, but especially, according to him, the ability to sometimes or habitually walk upright. Accordingly, most of the South African hominids are considered to be pre-human, non-human, with ape-like, tree climbing, and human characteristics, walking upright. He explains how they may be the ancestors of modern humans, but are themselves not quite human yet. According to their time scale, these fossils are between 1.8 and 3.5 million years old. In creation science, the term hominid has no meaning, since there only exists humans and non-human primates. By the way, did you know that many anthropologists have never seen an original hominid fossil? Even Darwin had, in his life, never seen an original human fossil, but that certainly did not stop him from publishing a complete book on human evolution in 1871. Thomas Huxley, also called Darwin's bulldog, had also never seen an original human fossil, but that did not stop him from giving a complete description of them in his 1863 publication, Man's Place in Nature. What you usually see are the reproductions or imitations of the original fossils that are made, amongst other materials, out of gypsum, plaster of Paris. Some of these reproductions are of a high quality, but unfortunately this has not always been the case, and you can read all about that in the book. A further problem with these gypsum reproductions is that only a small percentage of hominid fossil material and less than half of the most important fossil material are available for further studies. When researchers want to study these fossils, they first have to submit a project proposal. If this is approved, the specific fossil is assigned to them for a period of 4 to 7 years. For this time period, the fossil is unavailable to other researchers for comparative studies. Strictly speaking, only the original fossil should be used in the writing and publishing of scientific articles. Keeping all this in mind, we can draw the following conclusion. Since only a few researchers have access to the original fossils, and since only a limited number of fossils are available for reproductions, and reproductions should not be used in the writing of scientific articles, the science of paleontology has a serious problem. How do humans and apes or ape-like creatures differ? Well, for one, you don't have a tail. Human DNA, in other words, that special recipe that makes you, differs completely from monkeys, baboons, and all the rest of the ape-like creatures. The number of vertebrae in our spine differs. The shape and arrangement of our teeth differs. The 3 semicircular balance channels in the inner ear of humans and apes differ completely. Human feet differ completely from that of any animal in the world. The cranial capacity differs. This is measured by pouring seeds or something similar into the cranial capacity of the skull until it is nice and full. Thereafter, it's poured into a measuring jug so that one can take an exact measurement of the capacity. It's measured in cubic centimeters. So look at the cranial capacities of the following animals and compare that. Orangutans, 275 to 500 cc, gorilla 340 to 752, and humans 1,100 to 1,700 cubic centimeters. Apes can't tell any jokes because most of the jokes are on them. In other words, they cannot create humor, verbally, that is. They cannot cook, sing, draw pictures, appreciate art, or reason. They don't have the ability to think in an abstract way. They can't write a nice story or floss their teeth. They are unable to read this or understand it. Only humans have the ability to have a relationship with God, because that is how God planned it. There are, of course, many other examples, but for now, that will suffice. So we have to ask, are apes just furry little humans? The high percentage of genetic DNA similarity which primates have in common with humans are often presented as an evolutionary fact. Chimpanzee DNA is supposed to be anywhere between 96% to 98.7% identical to humans, depending on who's telling the story. The reason for the variation is that no one has yet sequenced an ape's DNA. Nevertheless, for the last 40 plus years, since the early 1970s, a general 98.5% similarity has been presented to us as a scientific fact. Now, anyone who looks at chimpanzee will instinctively know that there are far greater number of differences between us and them than only 1.5%. This is called logic. So how are we supposed to interpret this seemingly high degree of shared DNA between humans and chimps? Would that make chimps more than 90% human? It is worth repeating what prominent evolutionist Steve Jones recently reminded his audience of with regards to the man-chimp DNA sharing context. We also share about 50% of our DNA with bananas, and that doesn't make us half bananas, either from the waist up or the waist down. Furthermore, the entire project regarding the mapping of the sequence of the human genome was carried out by a consortium of 5 nations and was not even completed by 2001. The human genome refers to the complete sets of genetic material within humans. You see, in order to compare 2 items with one another, the human genome and the chimp genome, you have to have the information of both items. May we then ask, if the initial research regarding the Human Genome Project was not yet completed by 2001, and the Chimpanzee Genome Project was still in its infancy in the early 1970s, what is the 98.5% DNA similarity of the early 1970s based on? A new figure of 94% has now been proposed by the same man, Roy Britton, who proposed the 98.5% figure in 1970. The amount of information contained within the DNA of every human cell is compared to 1,000 books, each with 500 pages. Even if people differed from apes by only 4%, it is the equivalent of 120 million base pairs, which is equal to 40 large books filled with information. It is still an impossible barrier for mutations to bridge, even with their millions of years. There are about 35 million single-letter differences that separate humans and chimps. If you randomly take sections of the chimpanzee sequencing data and try to find matches in the human genome, and vice versa, you will find less than 90% similarity. Moreover, many sections of the chimpanzee genome simply do not exist in humans. In the segments of the genome that are similar enough to make a comparison, the percentage of actual similarity between humans and chimp DNA is probably closer to 80%. Clearly, the degree of similarity is much less than most people claim. Haldane was a famous evolutionary geneticist and one of the founders of the scientific field of population dynamics. In 1957, he indicated how the limited rate whereby beneficial mutations could have developed in hominids made it impossible for humans to have evolved from a common ape-like ancestor over the last 10 million years. This is known as Haldane's dilemma, and it is still unresolved. Haldane therefore showed how there is too much variation, too much DNA to mutate, and too few generations for all this in which to happen. In the evolutionary model, there have only been 3 to 6 million years since humans and chimps diverged. Average human generation times of 20 to 30 years gives them only 100,000 to 300,000 generations to fix the millions of mutations that separate humans and chimps, including at least 35 million single-letter differences. To solve this problem, evolutionary scientists concluded that most, 98% of the genome, our DNA, have no functionality. It does not code for proteins, and therefore it is some sort of leftover garbage from our evolutionary history, junk. As a result, they did no research on it. Many years later, they actually discovered that this so-called junk DNA has many important functions, including the formation of RNA, one of the cellular workhorses often affecting the formation of protein down the line. In fact, leading geneticist Professor John Mattick of the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia, recently said that the failure to recognize the implications of the non-coding DNA will go down as the biggest mistake in the history of molecular biology. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Proverbs 30 verse 8, remove falsehood and lies far from me. We have spoken about this, but it's worthwhile repeating it. Time and time again, when yet another so-called human ancestral fossil is discovered, why is there only one or at most a few pieces of him or her? Why aren't there hundreds or thousands or millions of them? If you believe that humans and non-human ancestors have existed for millions of years, then there should be millions upon millions of their fossil remains in the fossil record. Roger Levin wrote in The New Scientist, but the major problem has been the pitifully small number of hominoid fossils on which prehistorians exercise their imaginative talents. Why do they only find a few fragments of bone for each specimen, but never a complete skeleton? Aren't they perhaps reading a whole lot into a very little? Or is it possible that the less they find, the easier it is to make statements about it which cannot be proven? In this way, the position of bones can be shuffled around to resemble half ape, half human skulls and jaws. Few sciences produce such abundant returns from so few fragments of fact as paleontology. If human evolution is a fact, why do they struggle so much to find evidence of transitional forms in the fossil record, especially since there is so much study material available? Or is it a fact? Let's listen to what the evolutionists say. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. Darwin's argument still persists as the favored escape of most paleontologists from the embarrassment of a record that seems to show so little of evolution. We fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history, yet, to preserve our favorite account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as so bad that we never see the very process we profess to study. That is the evolutionist, Professor Stephen Jay Gould. My attempts to demonstrate evolution by an experiment carried on for more than 40 years have completely failed. The fossil material is now so complete that it has been possible to construct new classes, and the lack of transitional series cannot be explained as being due to scarcity of material. The deficiencies are real. They will never be filled. In the book, attention is focused on a long line of fraudulent hominid representations. We will only briefly look at a few. Have another look at this proposed evolutionary order. Australopithecus, followed by Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and eventually Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. So let's have a closer look. Australopithecines, such as Australopithecus africanus, means southern ape from Africa and refers to the name given to a variety of ape bones discovered in Africa. The first fossil Australopithecine was so named because it was discovered in South Africa by Raymond Dart. After thorough investigation, anthropologists solemnly declared that these were the remains of an ancient pre-human race that lived 1 to 3 million years ago. These bones have been discovered in various places in Africa, including Sterkfontein, Swartkrans, and Taung. They vary a lot, but they are all still apes. Some of the most well-known examples include Taung child, Mr. Ples, not Mrs. Ples, Australopithecus sediba, and of course, Lucy. Only 40% of Lucy's skeleton was ever discovered, and especially very little of her feet. Although Sussman and Stern investigated Lucy and declared that her thumb was ape-like, her fingers and toes long and curved for tree climbing, and that she probably nested and lived in trees worldwide, Lucy is still exhibited in museums with human-like feet, straight fingers and toes. Human feet differ completely from any animal feet. And as you can see from the photo on the right, they have no fossil evidence to support the exhibition of Lucy's feet. The estimated 2.5 million year old fossilized skull known as Mrs. Ples was discovered in 1947 by Robert Broom and John Robinson at the Sterkfontein Caves in South Africa. This fossil became known as Mrs. Ples because of the name Plesianthropus, which means almost human. This is similar to almost speaking the truth. Almost the truth is not the truth. Mrs. Ples was later reclassified as Australopithecus africanus, and according to Prof. Thackeray from Wits Institute for Human Evolution, is viewed by most people as the representative species from which humanity evolved. However, the shape and the size of the skull, as well as the cranial capacity of only 485 cubic centimeters, is clearly the same as that of all other apes. And after all, this is never even Mrs. Ples, but actually Mr. Ples. Then, of course, there is the 2010 Marupeng Buzz Australopithecus sediba. With an estimated age of 2 million years, this fossil was discovered in 2010 and is now being presented as the missing link in human evolution between Australopithecus africanus and either Homo habilis or Homo erectus. It appears as though there are serious differences amongst evolutionists regarding the type of hominid being represented by Australopithecus sediba, specifically whether it belongs to the genus Homo or Australopithecus. The cranial capacity of 420 cc, together with the estimated height of 1.3 meters, as well as the relatively long arms, provides excellent evidence for an Australopithecus rather than a Homo classification. The anatomist and evolutionist Charles Oxnard performed a detailed analysis of different bones of Australopithecus africanus and concluded that they did not walk upright like humans. He further confirmed that although it was initially thought that this group, the Australopithecines, were human-like, in reality they differ more from humans and African apes than these two groups differ from one another. More recently, he stated, "It is now recognized widely that the Australopithecines are not structurally closely similar to humans, that they must have been living at least in part in arboreal environments, and that many of the latest specimens and contemporaneans lived at the same time, or almost so, with the earlier members of the genus Homo. Australopithecines are very similar to the pygmy chimpanzee or bonobo. They are clearly extinct, non-human, African primates. Homo habilis. By 1959, there was a great need to find a hominid as the transitional species between the small Australopithecus, non-human, and the large Homo erectus, which everyone recognized as human. Homo habilis means handyman, and this was announced as the new human predecessor, the missing link. Modern humans, or Homo sapiens, meaning us, have a cranial capacity of about 1,500 cc. The cranial capacity of Homo habilis, however, is only 660 cc, but up to 900 have been discovered. Those discovered at Taung and Sterkfontein are around 430 cc. In the 1994 publication of the Nature Journal, Bernard Wood, perhaps the world's leading authority on evolutionary family trees from the George Washington University, announced that none of the Homo habilis fossils were the ancestors of humans, and that they probably belonged under the Australopithecine classification. Today, Homo habilis is no longer recognized as a valid or legal species. Without the species, the most important link between Australopithecus and humans is lost to the evolutionist. It is, however, still showcased in museums and, of course, in your school books. Milford Walpole from the University of Michigan, who both needs and believes in Homo habilis, states it very well. The phylogenetic outlook suggests that if there weren't a Homo habilis, we would have to invent one. Homo erectus. This includes, amongst others, Java man, Peking man, Piltdown man, Nebraska man. The detailed fraudulent acts carried out by various paleontologists is detailed in the book. Let's just briefly look at them, and we begin with Java man. In 1891, Eugene Dubois discovered a cranial bone, the upper part of the skull bone, in Java, Indonesia. A year later, and 15 meters further, he discovered a femur and assumed that these bones belonged to the same individual. The age was estimated to be around 500,000 years, based on the sedimentary layer in which the fossils were found. For many years, Dubois maintained that the remains were that of a half-human, half-ape named Pithecanthropus erectus, upright ape man. Decades later, the name was replaced with Homo erectus. But all through the 20th century, these bones, the cranial and the femur, was presented as Java man, the missing link between apes and humans. The truth, however, is that the thigh was that of an ordinary human, while the cranial bone belonged to a gibbon. Java man, referring to the thigh bone, is not our evolutionary predecessor, but rather a true member of the human race, a post-flood descendant of Adam, and a smaller version of a Neanderthal. We're still busy with the class Homo erectus. In 1908 and 1911, Charles Dawson discovered pieces of a human skull. Further excavations of skull pieces and animal fossils were made, and in 1912, Dawson and Woodward announced their discovery of the earliest Englishman named Piltdown man. It caused a huge sensation in newspapers and scientific circles. Some paleoanthropologists, however, questioned the association between these parts. To make it more convincing, they needed canines, and voila! In 1913, the Jesuit Catholic priest Taylor de Jardin discovered the much-needed canines. Isn't that remarkable? For almost 40 years, the scientific world bowed down real low before Piltdown man as the key in human evolution. Paintings were made of the important names of people that did research on him, and 3 of them were later awarded knighthood by the King of England. Such it is in the world of evolutionary glory. Completely ignored was the report of a dentist who in 1916 had already declared that the teeth had been filed down by someone. In 1953, 40 years later, a newly developed fluorine test was performed on the bones just to discover that Mr. Piltdown was a huge fraud. Someone took the jaw of an orangutan and placed it inside a human skull. The fact that it was an orangutan bone was only discovered in 1982. The teeth were filed down and the whole caboodle was carefully stained to make it look ancient. Your mom may have tried that on some of your furniture. I know this mom did, and it was a huge mess. Imported mammal fossils and handmade tools were placed nearby. It took the world 40 years to expose that particular act of deception. Radiocarbon dating determined the age to be between 520 and 720 years old, far too young to be part of the proposed human evolution. More than 500 doctoral theses were written on Mr. Piltdown. He certainly was a famous fake. Moving on to America. In 1922, the discovery of yet another one-tooth wonder was announced. A single molar was discovered by Harold Cook in 1917, who sent it to Osborn for identification in 1922. Osborn, a paleontologist and president of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, was extremely excited about this. He was also a member of the American Civil Liberties Union and saw this as a very valuable piece of evidence to strengthen their cause at the Scopes monkey trial. However, they were never allowed to present this tooth as evidence, since by that time it had already been challenged by 9 authorities. However, within just 1 month, Osborn declared that the tooth was 100% anthropoidic, human ape, and introduced it to the American public as the first ever American ape man named Nebraska Man. Grafton Elliott Smith was one of the people involved in publishing Nebraska Man, and in one of his articles he included a noteworthy illustration that was done by Amadea Forestier. Based on that single tooth, he managed to conjure up an illustration of how he thought this ape man would have looked. You know, you should give that a try. Next time you have one of your teeth extracted, why don't you have a friend take it to an artist and ask your friend to ask the artist that he should draw a picture of you? You will collect it later that week. No one can do that. After further research was done at Snake Creek, where the tooth was found, another wild, imaginary fairy tale came to an end when it was discovered that the tooth actually belonged to a pig that they thought were extinct. But they were wrong again, because in 1972, Ralph Wetzel discovered a whole herd of these Nebraska pig man or man pigs in Paraguay, quietly munching away. So who's who in the zoo? Both Australopithecus and Homo habilis turned out to be real apes. For the evolutionist, Homo erectus is a very important category as the so-called transitional taxon between the Australopithecines, which we already know is non-human, and the Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, which we all know as fully human. It comes as yet another surprise that Homo erectus provides powerful evidence against the concept of human evolution. There is no evidence in existence to prove that Homo erectus differs adequately in morphology from Homo sapiens to be classified as a separate species. By every legal standard, including fossil and cultural evidence, it is very clear that Homo erectus was fully human and should be classified as Homo sapiens. We are not family. Neanderthals are regarded as the most recent discovery of fossilized humans. The year was 1856 when workers blasted a cave open near the Neander Valley in Düsseldorf, Germany. Inside, they discovered various bones. The bones were investigated by scientists and evolutionary scientists, and for a few years everyone agreed that it was simply ordinary human bones. Professor Rudolf Virchow, a German anatomist, also seen as the father of pathology, declared that the bones belonged to a modern human who suffered from arthritis and rickets. This is the disease that causes legs to curve outward. The main reason why people develop rickets is due to a lack of sunlight, which in turn causes a shortage of vitamin D production. Rickets and arthritis is characteristic of the Neanderthals and most probably the reason for their prominent eyebrow. It seems as though the Neanderthals lived at a time when there was not too much sunshine around. We've already spoken about the Ice Age and how it commenced after the flood, when volcanic dust pollution covered the whole world. At that stage, the weather in Europe was so freezingly cold that people must have remained in caves where very little sunlight was absorbed. And just as I mentioned, this lack of sunlight would cause a lack of vitamin D production, and the resultant general incidence of rickets, the disease that causes those legs to curve outward. The public is unaware of the fact that Neanderthal dwellings, which they built themselves, have been discovered. Not caves, dwellings. In 1908, a relatively complete Neanderthal-type skeleton was discovered in a cave in France. Marcel Ball, a well-known paleontologist from the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, was asked to reconstruct the man. Now, despite all the previous evidence that Neanderthals were simply ordinary people, and based on his preconceived idea of human evolution, he did his best to depict the bones as ape-like in his construction and his description. Ball simply ignored the previous evidence and declared that this species was not able to walk upright. He placed the head on the neck in an unbalanced manner and he bent the knees. He also placed the weight of the foot on the outside with the toes turned inward, all just to present some distorted impression that this man walked like an ape. Now, this contorted version of Neanderthals dominated the world's view of them for 44 years. Even though it was proven as false in 1957 by Strauss and Cave, it took the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago a further 20 years to rectify their exhibitions halfway. Do you think they got rid of the fraudulent exhibitions? Oh no. They simply moved it to another location, right next to the skeleton of a dinosaur called an Apatosaurus. In this way, many more children would be able to see it and be brainwashed into believing that evolution is true. They now refer to it as an alternative presentation of the Neanderthal. This is a blatant lie. The Bible indicates how people lived longer before and also after the flood for a while, and how their longevity declined in the time roughly between Abram and Moses. It is evident from the fossils that they were very strong, much stronger than the stronger bodybuilder today. They often lived in caves, they hunted, fished, designed and made tools, made fire, and buried their dead. They had a well-developed culture and also practiced religion. Another interesting fact regarding Neanderthals is that they had a larger cranial capacity, larger than we have. In other words, they had more brain power than we have. This is in direct contradiction with the evolutionary idea of increasing complexity and rather indicative of a decline in the human race than an improvement. Many scientists, including the famous Louis Leakey, have made the mistake of thinking that the discovery of an Australopithecus together with tools suggested that they, the apes, were the tool makers. Stated differently, they conclude that the ape men made and used the tools themselves. The far more likely explanation is that humans used the tools on the apes. In other words, they ate the apes, just like they still do in many African countries today. You see, one always seems to come back to those colored lenses, to a preconceived notion that influence the way in which we interpret the evidence. Because the vast majority of Neanderthal and large animal fossils are found in caves, it can also be interpreted as follows. Large grazers never occur in caves. Only humans could have taken parts of these animals into caves after they were hunted and killed. The larger the animal, the more likely it is that it ended up in the cave due to Neanderthal activity, especially considering that the bones often show evidence of stone tools that were used to butcher them. Carnivores normally prefer to devour their prey right there in the close proximity to where it was caught, rather than to waste energy in dragging it to a cave. Other animals sometimes use caves in which to hibernate. This is why their fossils also occur in caves. One critical writer asked why so many bunnies are found in caves where the great hunter Neanderthals lived. Professor Lubenow responded by describing that question as silly beyond belief. I cannot help but agree. Simply because Mr. Neanderthal was out on a big game hunting expedition does not mean that he would let the chance slip by to devour a little rabbit on the way, especially if he was really hungry. So if Mr. Neanderthal usually prefers a nice juicy T-bone steak for dinner, it's not to say that he would not enjoy a little rabbit for breakfast, any less. To hunt for a living with the use of only simple stone tools requires skill, courage, and precision that few hunters possess today. They had to plan in advance, and this clearly indicates their intelligence, the very aspect that evolutionists so desperately want you to believe they didn't have. They had to hunt and defend themselves against mammoths, elephants, giant long-horned oxen, giant bison, giant rock bears, giant pigs, giant hyenas, giant animals. It is quite clear that they had a highly developed intelligence and culture. The Neanderthal fossils show injuries that are typical of people that often handle large animals, just like the cowboys that are often kicked by their cattle. It is very clear that the Neanderthals were fantastic big game hunters. I wouldn't mess with one of them, and I definitely would not tell him that he was my ape-like ancestor. There's clear evidence to show that Neanderthals were only a few hundred years old. Did you know that the bones in your face continue to grow throughout your life? The little wolf in Red Riding Hood may have been nothing more than a Neanderthal with a huge nose and ears. Accordingly, if you lived for a few hundred years, your face would look quite different than when you were younger. Furthermore, a Neanderthal skeleton in full suit of armor was discovered in Poland in 1908, and the armor was not even completely rusted. At the present time, most scientists agree that Neanderthals were simply ordinary people who lived in caves for a while. They had a well-developed culture, which included art and religion. Unfortunately, we are still waiting for the children's books to catch up to this information. In September 2015, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger of Wits University, along with a team of international scientists, announced the discovery of hominin remains they have named Homo naledi. This consisted of 1,550 bones, which represented at least 15 individuals. What makes this announcement different is that all the previous discoveries of hominid remains in this area had been designated as Australopithecus. Keep in mind that Australopithecus have been dismissed by prominent evolutionary authorities such as Charles Oxnard as unique, extinct primates, irrelevant to human evolution and anatomically more distant from both apes and humans than humans and apes are from each other. And of course, we should not forget that the naming of a new fossil hominid species is almost always accompanied by fame and prestige. Since Berger's interpretation of Australopithecus sediba was dismissed as too young, too weird, and not in the right place to be ancestral, some say that Berger's quest to regain the spotlight required for him to find a Homo classification. Keep in mind that in order to name a new fossil, hominid species, the fossil must be sufficiently different from anything else to warrant such a classification. The best way to ensure this is to emphasize attributes that give it its appearance, whether real or not, of being composed of a mixture of features present in other established fossil species, but in a combination not seen before, with perhaps some unique attributes as well. And this is exactly what happened with Homo naledi. The bones were discovered in the remote Dinaledi chamber of the Rising Star cave system. It is believed that these bones paint a mosaic picture, a transitional species between Australopithecus apes and humans with attributes of both. It is important to mention that the bones, which were lying all over, were not heavy like most fossils that have turned to stone. And further, the ease with which most of the bones that were not on top were excavated from the soil that have not yet lithified, that it's not yet turned to stone, all indicate that the bones are probably young. The whole scene reminds more of a battlefield than a paleontological graveyard. But it was what was on the floor that drew the two men's attention. There were bones everywhere. The cavers first thought they must be modern. They weren't stone heavy like most fossils, nor were they encased in stone. They were just lying about on the surface, as if someone had tossed them in. They noticed a piece of a lower jaw with teeth intact. It looked human. This makes one wonder whether this was not exactly what had happened, especially since the rest of the article states it was clear from the arrangement of the bones that someone had already been there, perhaps decades before. Many believe that the identity is dependent on dating of the remains. No effort has been made yet to date these bones. Berger's excuse was that it would not be ethical to destroy material before it had been described. One piece from 1,550 pieces? The real reason why carbon-14 dating has not yet been done is because evolutionary scientists are very familiar with the fact that the assumptions on which this dating method rests would give you a maximum age of 50,000 to 60,000 years for samples that contain carbon-14. In the very next lecture, we'll be discussing some of these dating methods. Creation Ministries International published an official challenge addressed to the Geosciences Department to anyone involved with the Dinaledi claims that as a ministry, they would fund the carbon-14 analysis if the samples are made available to them and in a manner acceptable to both parties, ensuring that contamination has been avoided. Carbon-14 dating would no doubt indicate a young age and refute the estimated 2.5 million year age. Of interest also is whether they will be able to extract and sequence DNA from the bones. One has to keep in mind that this skeleton is a composite of fossil elements representing multiple individuals, 15 to be exact. Many people, such as Jeffrey Schwartz from the University of Pittsburgh, think that there is too much variety in the material to represent only one species. Also keep in mind that features considered unique or primitive may simply indicate pathology rather than be characteristic of a new species. This means that the features may be the result of a disease. Most of the features described as primitive still fall within the range of human variation, whether human or more robust humans such as Homo erectus and Neanderthals. However, the arched fingers and small brain capacity fall without this range, but may also be the result of bone pathology, such as a vitamin D deficiency, rickets, and cretinism. Now, cretinism is a condition where the physical and mental growth is seriously retarded due to a shortage of the thyroid hormone and an iodine deficiency. It can reduce the brain capacity by up to 50%. Small-brained Homo erectus may have given rise to small-brained humans, similar to Homo sapiens populations from Palau, Micronesia. The evolutionist Tim White said the following: Berger's findings are probably South African representatives of Homo erectus. The Homo naledi cranium is similar in conformation and size to the earliest and most primitive Homo erectus representatives. Now, some of the features of Homo naledi, such as the curved fingers and flaring pelvis, as well as the small brain size, have been documented in modern humans with cretinism. People with cretinism's features also vary a lot. In fact, it would be no surprise to find out that many of the so-called hominids are in actual fact robust humans who suffered from cretinism. It is remarkable that so many features similar to those normally present in great apes, in Australopithecus and Paranthropus, and in early Homo, but not in modern Homo sapiens, are generated in humans by growth deficits due to the absence of thyroid hormone. In other words, many of the pathological features of cretinism mimic the primitive characters of evolution, making it easy to mistake pathological features for primitive characters. The differences can be disentangled by understanding the underlying biology of characters. This is Charles Oxnard. It has also been suggested that Homo naledi was placed inside this hard-to-reach chamber by other naledis, who had to go through complicated burial rituals and acrobatical lengths to accomplish this feat. Their loved ones had to be dragged through various small dark spaces and eventually dropped via a slide into the Dinaledi chamber. The so-called new species and dumping of the dead is supported by the media but not by the data. Another possible scenario should be to consider the following. What if the individuals, being different because they were cretins, became vilified by or ostracized from their community because of their disease, perhaps blamed for some misfortune by a superstitious community? As a result, they could have been forced into the chamber and left there to die. Other suggestions is that they may have sheltered together, hiding from the rest of the population. It may also be that the Dinaledis used the chamber as some sort of garbage disposal area where human remains were disposed of after cannibalistic feats or rituals elsewhere. The truth is, no one really knows. Creationist organizations such as CMI and Answers in Genesis are researching the claims and will in future publish a detailed technical assessment. What these bones are not is a glorious mosaic of emerging humanity superimposed on an Australopithecus base. In other words, some kind of missing link between ape-like ancestors and man, which is clearly what Berger and his team are clearly inferring. The only way to find a bridge between apes and humans would be to seriously and deliberately misinterpret the fossils as something in between. Scientists often remark that race and language seem to indicate that all humans migrated from a central point in the Near East or Asia Minor. This corresponds to the time after the flood and the fact that the ark came to rest in the area of eastern Turkey. While the races moved out further from the central point, there was a brief interval that scientists refer to as the Stone Age. This is where pottery, agriculture, poultry, domestic animals, metalworks, villages, and writings began. In later centuries, some of these cultures regressed back to a more primitive lifestyle. Evolutionists tell us that humans originated from somewhere in Central Africa because some ape bones were discovered there. But why did all the earliest human cultures then commence in the Near East? Each of these historical civilizations were advanced, But from time to time, groups of people moved to other parts and they lived in Stone Age type of cultures for a while. This was, of course, only for a short period until they managed to build villages, plant crops, and to farm with their new animals. Many scientists believe that the primitive Stone Age people are not evidence of earlier life forms, but rather tribes that became isolated from the rest of civilization. Now, one of the very first introductions you have had to the concept of evolution is probably the pictures of dinosaurs and cavemen. You now know that it is true. A huge newsflash. People used to live in caves for a while. In fact, some people still live in caves today. The climate probably caused them to move around, and they chose to live in caves for a while until they began to build their houses. The fact that some people lived in caves for a while provides no evidence for the evolution of one kind into another. We also know today that advanced civilizations, as well as more primitive Stone Age cultures, lived at the very same time. There is no reason whatsoever to conclude that less advanced people were the ancestors of more advanced ones, especially not because they lived in caves for a while. The most overwhelming evidence in support of Neanderthals being members of the human species is the discovery of humans with Neanderthal morphology as well as humans with modern morphology buried together in 4 different localities. So salute the caveman and bid him goodbye, for the one being present to you has never existed. Now, the Cradle of Humankind museum exhibitions at Sterkfontein as well as those at Marupeng, are very impressive and seemingly rather convincing regarding the evolutionary doctrine. When it comes to evolutionary propaganda, they don't whisper, they shout it out loud, mainly through illustrations, fossil replicas, as well as audio-visual material. Some of the deceptions include figures of a male and female ape-man pair with half-ape, half-human faces, upright modern human bodies, human feet with big toes standing somewhat outward, for your monkey business, remember? Absolutely nothing about these specific deceptive artworks is based on any fossil evidence whatsoever. Otherwise, there would have at least been some sort of description. But alas, there is nothing, other than meet the family, and the same old regarding the evolutionary sequence. There is no description, name, age, or any other facts regarding these misleading and downright vulgar images. In spite of this, it is still very successful in deceiving people, especially the younger children who would not have read the description anyway. Then there are all sorts of nice pictures of hominid faces, beginning with the Australopithecus via all sorts of science fiction type Homo species, right up to beautiful you and me today. The noses in particular vary considerably from the indented gorilla type noses to less indented to modern human schnozzles. No fossilized nose cartilage or material has ever been found, as confirmed by Prof. Thackeray of the Wits Institute for Human Evolution. Cartilage is not usually preserved in fossil contexts, but the probable position of cartilage can be inferred using forensic techniques. So there is no fossil evidence for their wild imaginary trains of thought. It is simply a representation of how they believe it probably must have looked. All the museum exhibitions of the so-called Homo sapiens ancestors have typical human eyes with large white parts. The color of the eyes and the surrounding muscle and skin material has definitely not been found in the fossil record either. It is not based on any fossil evidence. Another wild goose chase. Now the moment of truth has arrived. What does the fossil record and evidence really say? No meaningful hominid family tree has ever been compiled, nor will it ever be. The evolutionist Mary Leakey admitted to this herself. In the present state of our knowledge, I do not believe it is possible to fit the known hominid fossils into a reliable pattern. And then this quote from the New Scientist: the entire hominid collection known today would barely cover a billiard table. The collection is so tantalizingly incomplete, and the specimens themselves often so fragmented and inconclusive, that more can be said about what is missing than about what is present. But ever since Darwin's work inspired the notion that fossils linking modern man and extinct ancestor would provide the most convincing proof of human evolution, preconceptions have led evidence by the nose in the study of fossil man. Usually only a few fragments of the fossil skeletons are discovered, and consequently many assumptions are made. The problem with a lot of anthropologists is that they want so much to find a hominid that any scrap of bone becomes a hominid bone. The so-called human ancestor, so-called common ancestor of humans and apes is still unknown, and no one has any idea what this ancestor looked like. In spite of this, there has to be one for the evolutionist. The various so-called transitional forms are always either an ape or a human. Homo erectus, the Neanderthals, and early Homo sapiens lived as contemporaries over extended periods of time. The one did not evolve from the other, and they all belong to one and the same species, Homo sapiens. Modern man has existed from the beginning. Humans carried out intelligent operations ever since the beginning. The Ice Age probably gave rise to widespread rickets due to a lack of sunlight and therefore vitamin D. Rickets and cretinism could have also contributed to the exceptional morphology of Homo erectus, early Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals. Advanced age could have contributed to the morphology which today is less frequently found. Some fossil evidence supports the 250 to 300-year-old ages of humans just after the flood. Adam and Eve had more than enough genetic variety for their descendants to vary enormously. To this very day, fossil discoveries have served only to reinforce the truth of creation. This is why you will never find any complete diagrams of human evolution in evolutionist sources as those found in Professor Lubinau's book. Why not? Because there are far more questions than answers. Evolutionary diagrams only contain fragments of information, but you will never find a time diagram that categorizes all the human fossils according to their individual morphological descriptions. Even Richard Leakey, the most prestigious hominid bone hunter of the last 20 years, began to ask questions. When asked on a television program to give a name for our common ancestor, he walked over to the blackboard and his illustrated answer was this. During the Chicago Evolution Conference held in 1980, 160 of the leading evolutionary scientists gathered and agreed that not even new Darwinism, mutations together with natural selection, can be accepted as scientifically sound. In 1981, Colin Patterson, the senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, declared that evolution was positively anti-knowledge. He added, "All my life I had been duped into taking evolution as revealed truth." Patterson was in charge of millions of fossils and is very familiar with them. Moreover, Drs. Patterson, Raup, and Elridge spent a lifetime studying and analyzing fossils. Together, they are in control of more than 50% of the world's fossil collections. They have access to it and work with the evidence every day. Please note that these people are committed evolutionists, and even by interpreting the record through their evolutionary lenses, they admitted that it was extremely rare to find transitional forms, not that it was impossible in principle. The various evolutionary quotes expressing their doubts and referred to throughout this series makes it very clear to us as creationists that there are no transitional fossils. This means a kind is a kind and never changes into another kind. Each kind was created uniquely by the hand of God. Scientists who go about teaching that evolution is a fact of life are great con men, and the story they are telling may be the greatest hoax ever. In explaining evolution, we do not have one iota of fact. Scientists at the National Institutes of Health recently announced that they had put together a draft of the entire sequence of the human genome, and the researchers had unanimously declared there is only one race, the human race. Many people will have a serious problem with this information, as well as that contained in the book. They may even react by sending me some seriously angry worded emails. But what I can guarantee is this: none of those emails will have been written by an ape. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding. Thank you very much. In the next lecture, we will be discussing radiometric dating.